Good evening. Call to order the joint special meeting of the Town Council and the Planning Commission for a study session regarding SB 330 and particularly Builder's Remedy. So thank you for all attending. I'm going to ask for the roll call, and then I'll explain how we're planning to run the meeting tonight.
Okay. Councilmember Risto? Here. Councilmember Rennie?
Here.
Councilmember Badami?
Here.
Vice Mayor Moore?
Here.
Mayor Hudis?
Here.
Commissioner Stump? Here. Commissioner Raspy?
Here.
Commissioner Burnett?
Here.
Commissioner Susan Burnett?
Here.
Commissioner Jeffrey Burnett?
Here.
Vice Chair Birch?
Here.
Chair Thomas?
Here.
Okay, thank you all, and thank you for joining. I know this is a topic of interest. We've done a number of study sessions, and I want to thank Ms. Gatos for joining us today, again, being willing to come back, and we really appreciate your input. The way we're going to run the meeting today is we're going to try to do a Q&A format as much as possible. So at first we'll have a presentation from Ms. Gatos, and then we'll move to the commissioners and council for questions, and we'll take a number of questions, but we'll try to get the answer immediately after the question where possible. And if staff needs more time, then we can do those later. And then we will move to public comment and verbal communications. And so if you'd like to speak, please fill out a card so I can call on you then. And you'll have the opportunity, both in person and on Zoom, to ask questions as well. And based on any questions you have, I will direct those to staff to answer those again in real time as much as possible. Then we'll come back to the Council and Planning Commission for another round of questions, and then there'll be a summation on where we go at really just what do we do next following that. So with that, why don't we start with a presentation? And again, I would invite anyone who would like to speak or ask a question to fill out a card and get that up here so that we're ready when it's that time. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor. Gabrielle Whelan, Town Attorney, and I will start us off with this PowerPoint presentation that is up on the screen. Tonight's meeting is a joint study session of the Town Council and the Planning Commission. The purpose of this study session is to review recent updates to state builder's remedy law and to discuss how builder's remedy projects will be analyzed under CEQA. Could you forward to the next slide? Thanks. I would like to make a recommendation for tonight's meeting. It is imperative that there be no discussion of specific planning applications that are pending. The purpose of this admonition is to avoid any challenges to future town decisions on the basis that the decision makers had prejudged any planning applications. And so tonight's discussion will be limited to the builder's remedy in general and CEQA in general, and will not be discussing any specific projects. Now I would like to introduce Barbara Kautz with the law firm of Goldfarb and Littman. Ms. Kautz is known as a statewide expert on housing law, and we are honored to have her with us this evening.
Well, thank you very much. I think you need to go 2 slides ahead, at least, and maybe next slide. So the builder's remedy is associated with a provision that was passed in 2019 and became effective in 2020 that allowed applicants to submit something called a preliminary application, which requires a number of specific items. And if they submit a preliminary application that includes everything that's required, then they vest, meaning they're entitled to use the town standards that existed on the date when they submitted a preliminary application that had everything. The vesting only covers local standards, standards of local agencies. It does not include state laws. So if state laws change, applicants are subject to them and/or entitled to use them, depending on which way it goes. So a number of the projects before the town now submitted preliminary applications before the Department of Housing and Community Development had certified the town's housing element as in compliance with state law. So those projects then may be eligible to use what's called the builder's remedy, which allows projects, housing projects, it's limited to housing projects, to avoid local zoning. And one of the laws, one of, I don't know what, back, sorry, back, okay. All right, forward, okay. One of the laws passed this year that was effective on January 1st, 2025, says that the adequacy of the housing element is determined as of the date that the preliminary application is submitted. That had been somewhat up in the air, but the legislature adopted this statute saying that whether or not the housing element is adequate or not is determined on the date that the preliminary application is submitted. So next slide. So what projects can use the builder's remedy? So the legislature made a lot of changes in laws affecting the builder's remedy that were effective on January 1st. So before January 1st, it applied, somebody could say that they wanted to use the builder's remedy so long as 20% of the total units in their housing project were affordable to lower income households or 100% affordable to moderate income households. That was in effect before 2025. Next slide. And for those projects, if they were submitted when a city had a housing element that didn't conform with state law, they could argue that they were builder's remedy projects. And the way the builder's remedy projects worked is if a project is defined as affordable, which before this year meant that it had 20% of the total units as low income, a city could only deny a project if it could make one of 5 findings. And these are very much summarized here. One is that the town had actually constructed all the housing in its regional housing needs that were proposed in the project. So the town would actually have had to, issue building permits for any lower income units, all the lower income units that were included in its regional housing needs. A second way is if there is a specific adverse impact to public health and safety that can't be mitigated. And to have a specific adverse impact, it has to be based on an objective health and safety standard that was in effect when the preliminary application was submitted. The violation of that standard has to cause a public specific adverse impact on public health and safety, and there can't be any way to mitigate it. So if the town, for instance, could require somebody to correct the problem by conforming with the standard, then it couldn't make this finding. A project can also be denied if it doesn't comply with state or federal law, and there's really no reasonable way for it to comply. And fourth, proposed on agricultural land or water and either water or, on agricultural land, or water or sewer facilities are inadequate. And then the last is that a city could deny a project if it's inconsistent with both the zoning ordinance and the general plan's land use designation. But to make this finding, a city has to have a housing element that complies with state law, and it can't be on a site designated in the housing element for lower or moderate income housing if the project's consistent with the housing element density. If a community does not have a housing element in substantial conformance with state law, it can't make this finding even if the project is completely inconsistent with the zoning ordinance and the general plan. If the town wanted to make one of these findings, its findings have to be based on the preponderance of the evidence, not just substantial evidence. And the town has the burden of proof in defending any litigation. If the town loses, it has to pay the applicant's attorney's fees. It's also the way the law's been implemented. It's frankly almost impossible for cities to appeal a negative decision at the trial court because a developer can request the court to impose a bond on the city, and the bonds have been extremely high. The ones I'm aware of have ranged from $7 million to $35 million, and as a consequence, I'm not aware of any city that's appealed a negative decision regarding whether the project's eligible for the builder's remedy. Next slide. So there are a variety of key changes that were effective January 1st. One is that the legislature substantially reduced the affordability requirements. If you recall, before January 1st, projects had to have 20% of the total units as affordable to lower income households. Now, only 13% of what's called the base density, i.e. the density before the project gets a density bonus. And just as an example, if you have 100 units with 13 affordable units, as required here, the minimum 13%, the project's entitled to a 25% density bonus and could get 125 units. Now, in the past, the project with 125 units would have needed to provide 25 affordable units, but under the statute as it's changed, it only has to provide 13 affordable units. So it really has reduced the number of affordable units that a builder's remedy project needs to include. It also includes a project with 10 or fewer units on a site of less than an acre at a minimum density of 10 units an acre, or 100% moderate income project. Next slide. And then the law now has a definition of a builder's remedy project, which is, so it has to meet the affordability standards, the new ones I mentioned, on or after the date the preliminary application was filed. The town didn't have a housing element conforming with state law, and it has to meet certain minimum or maximum densities, but the densities are very high. In Los Gatos, on any site, regardless of the zoning, a builder's remedy project can have a base density of at least 80 units an acre, and higher where there's higher density. Plus, it's allowed a density bonus of up to 100%. So a project can meet this new definition of a builder's remedy project with 160 units an acre. Next slide. So if the project meets the definition, the town has to, in evaluating the project, the town has to use a zoning district that allows the density and type of development, if one exists. And type of development they define as multifamily, townhouse, single family. If one doesn't exist, because the city doesn't have zones that allow 80 units an acre, the developer can identify standards in other zones that make the project, that fit the project that's being proposed. So a developer could look at, say, the commercial zone and find some standard that maybe doesn't have any setback at all and say, I want those standards to apply to my project. The city, in acting on the project, can't take any action that makes the project infeasible or precludes the project from being constructed as proposed by the applicant. And as proposed by the applicant means that after the project gets waivers and concessions and other density bonuses, the city can't change the density, the unit size, the unit type, the site plan, the building massing, the floor area, open space, et cetera. Builders' remedies projects are considered to conform with the zoning and general plan for all purposes. And existing projects can elect to opt into all or some of the new provisions. By existing projects, those that were proposed before January 1st of 2025. If a project's been proposed as a builder's remedy project and doesn't meet the definition, say if the density is even higher than allowed, then it has to use the 2024 provisions and provide the 20% of total units as affordable. Next slide. And then other key changes that were effective January 1st. It states that either approval by HCD or a court is required for the housing element to be compliant. And it states that that's, quote, declaratory of existing law. Now that's probably going to be challenged. One of my litigation partners says the legislature says that when it's really not declaratory, when it's really a change in the law. But in any case, that's what the statute says. And I think that council's aware and the commission's aware that HCD found the element adopted January 30th, 2023 not to be in compliance. There's also a rebuttable presumption, meaning HCD is assumed to be correct unless you can show that they're not, whether they approve the housing element or disapprove the housing element. The law used to be that there was a rebuttable presumption HCD was correct if it approved the housing element, but not if it disapproved the housing element. But the legislature extended that to findings that the housing element didn't comply. So HCD is assumed to be correct, although, you know, it's rebuttable, you can argue. Next slide. And I think Gabrielle is going to talk about CEQA.
Thank you. So the California Environmental Quality Act is commonly referred to as CEQA, and it applies to projects. The term project is defined as a discretionary action undertaken by a public agency that has the potential to cause a physical change in the environment. When the town CEQA consultant undergoes CEQA review, the first step is to determine whether or not there are any applicable exemptions. The CEQA guidelines contain a number of exemptions. If a project is not exempt from CEQA, the consultant will prepare an initial study to evaluate the effects of a proposed project, and the initial study will end with either a conclusion that there should be a negative declaration or an environmental impact report. And I will start by talking about the most common exemptions from CEQA that are used. Next slide, please. The most commonly used exemption is the infill exemption, and that applies to development that's surrounded by urban uses on all sides, and it's under a certain amount of acreage. It only applies when a project is consistent with applicable general plan and zoning code provisions. And so formerly, there was a debate as to whether builder's remedy projects were in fact consistent with all the applicable general plan and zoning code provisions. The legislature has adopted legislation providing that builder's remedy projects should be presumed to be consistent with the applicable general plan and zoning code provisions. And also there have to be no impacts on traffic, water, and air quality, noise. The project has to be adequately served by utilities and public services. There is a very important exception to the use of this infill exemption. One exception is the exemption cannot be used if there are unusual circumstances associated with the project. The exemption also cannot be used if cumulative impacts of projects of the same type in the same place would have a significant impact on the environment. Next slide, please. Another commonly cited exemption is 15183, and that applies to projects that are consistent with a local jurisdiction's general plan or zoning. And so this exemption can be used for projects that are consistent with the density that was examined in the 2040 and 2020 general plan EIRs. There is an important carve out to that provision that provides that there should be new CEQA review of any impacts that are quote unquote peculiar to the project. Next slide, please. If a project is determined not to be eligible for an exemption from CEQA, the consultant will prepare the initial study, and that will result in either the negative declaration, mitigated negative declaration, or environmental impact report. A negative declaration means that there are no significant impacts to the environment associated with the project. A mitigated negative declaration means that there would have been significant impacts associated with the project, but all of those impacts can be successfully mitigated. So as a result, there are no remaining significant impacts. And the third option is an environmental impact report, which is prepared if there will be significant impacts on the environment. Next slide, please. Cumulative impacts are evaluated in connection with each project that is proposed in the town. To date, the town CEQA consultants have been doing that analysis as part of the initial study for the project. However, based on public comment that has been received, town staff is interested in exploring the idea of commissioning a cumulative impacts analysis that could be used to cover all projects in the town at the same time, rather than doing it individually with initial studies for each individual project. And that concludes the presentation on CEQA. And so, Mayor, at this time, if there's any preliminary questions from the Town Council or the Planning Commission, Ms. Couts and I are available to answer them.
Thank you very much. And thank you to the Planning Commission for joining us tonight. Looking forward to the questions and answers. And before I start, I just wanted to start with kind of a fundamental, because I think it was covered in the detail, but I wanted to pop it up a level and say, you know, what are the fundamental differences between builder's remedy applications and SB 330 applications that do not invoke builder's remedy?
Really, there's not much of a difference, because if a project qualifies for the builder's remedy, it will kick in at the time that the town makes its ultimate decision on the project, because the statute provides that the project can only be denied or conditioned to render in such a way that renders it infeasible if the project meets one of those 5 criteria that were described in an earlier slide.
Okay, thank you. And so there is a list of current applications that meet the standard for builder's remedy, is that correct?
Yes.
Would you like to put that up there just so that we understand what the context is? I think that was provided as an addendum.
I don't know if I have the ability here to put that up on the slide, but is it the list of the 14 pending projects?
I don't know. It was something I received earlier today, which is a black and white with 14 projects.
Maybe I could read it into the record?
I don't think you want to read the detail. I
Okay.
just wanted
Okay.
the public to know what we're talking about here. Talking about this that was provided as an addendum today. Do we have it? Okay, while we're looking for it, why don't we then move to questions from council members, and I'm going to start at this end, and I saw Councilmember Badami's hand up.
Thank you. First of all, I do have this page, if that's what you're looking for, to put up on the projector. My question with the presentation had to do with page 14, infill exceptions, and it talks about unusual circumstances. It seems rather vague, so can you provide an example of what might constitute as being an unusual circumstance?
Interestingly, where projects have been challenged because an opponent of the project thought there were unusual circumstances, those have generally been unsuccessful. So there aren't, cases where I could cite that, a court found this to be unusual circumstances. Generally, the view of the courts is that a city's determination regarding whether a circumstance is unusual or not will be upheld if the city has substantial evidence to support its determination. So the lead case is one called, anyway, it was versus City of Berkeley. I think it's Berkeley Hillside Residence, something like that, where a house was proposed with 10 parking spaces and the neighbors, 10 garages, and it was a very, very large house, and the neighbors argued that it was unusual for the area, also cited things like being close to the Hayward Fault and other, and other features of the home. Berkeley said, no, it really wasn't unusual, and had evidence, and the court upheld Berkeley's determination despite the evidence of the opponents. So what would be unusual? I think a project that's maybe very different from those in the area or in the community, but I think it would all have to, there would have to be specific features of the project that the city would point to that made the project unusual.
Okay, thank you. And if I could ask just one more question. We did receive, a desk item today, and part of that desk item is what we just put on the projector. But along with it, it cited case law with a Save Our Neighborhood case. I don't know if you're familiar with that. Could you elaborate on that?
Yeah, the Save Our Neighborhood case, much of the reasoning was actually not approved by the California Supreme Court in another case called Friends of the College of San Mateo Gardens v. San Mateo Community College District. In the Lishman case that was attached to the materials, basically the court had a test about whether something seemed to be a new project or not. And so in this follow-on case, the California Supreme Court said that's too vague. What is a new project? There really aren't any standards. And the standard now, it was actually cited in one of the letters, and the standard that they upheld, sorry if you can just wait a second, was a standard for doing a supplemental or subsequent EIRs. And it's basically if there's substantial changes in the project that require major revisions of the earlier EIR because they're new significant environmental impacts or their environmental impacts are more serious. There's changes that occur with regard to circumstances under which the project's undertaken, which also require revisions of the EIR due to new impacts, and new information of substantial importance, which wasn't known at the time, also might cause the project to have one or more significant effects that weren't discussed. So, I mean, the whole definition's longer, but essentially it's that something's changed where there is evidence that there's new impacts. I think that's maybe a good summary of it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
That helps. Mayor, thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'll go down to this end. I'll start. Excuse me? So, Commissioner Stump.
Thank you. Looking back to your slide 17, I just want to say, appreciate the cumulative impacts stated here, that obviously they should be evaluated for each project, and they may be most efficient to commission a cumulative impact analysis used for all projects. I know that's been under discussion, and just glad to see it there. As a follow-on, what approach from a CEQA standpoint should the town consider on projects that are not within the scope of our 2040 general plan EIR? And I'm specifically speaking of 8 projects that are shown up here that range from 59 dwelling units per acre to 225 dwelling units per acre. Our EIR did not study anything above 40 dwelling units per acre. So again, my question, what approach from a CEQA standpoint should the town consider on those projects?
What I'd like to recommend is that we contact the 2 CEQA consultants that we have in mind and pose that question to them and see what they recommend.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. We'll go back down to this end, and we, people may didn't realize, but we're going to be taking questions as soon as I recognize them, whether it's a council member or a commissioner. So, Commissioner Burnett.
Thank you for that. So, question, while attending a Planning Commission seminar up in Santa Rosa a couple weeks ago, during one of the meetings, the question came up. The meeting was actually entitled Advanced CEQA, and there was the question about fair argument standard, where the EIR has a purposefully low threshold. So my question would be, can you comment on that? And I did slide up. Sorry. Yeah, there's a slide that if you want to, I think the fellow council members and commissioners were given a copy of what I brought. Yes.
Yeah, the commissioner kindly provided the slides from the presentation. Makes it very easy. As the town attorney said, the city has to first determine if a project's eligible for any exemption. And a project's entitled to an exemption if there's substantial evidence to support the exemption. There was a recent case saying that a city had to grant an exemption if a project was eligible for it. But if a project is not eligible for an exemption, then, as the commissioner said, there's a very low threshold for doing an EIR, which is why in some ways it's somewhat easier to challenge a negative declaration than it is to challenge an exemption. But essentially, as stated up here, the standard is whether there's substantial evidence of a fair argument that a project may cause an environmental impact. It doesn't. You don't have to. It doesn't need to be shown that it will have an environmental impact. It just needs to be shown that it may have an environmental impact, and then the project is supposed to have an EIR. Just to give a sense of how these standards are different. So in a standard for an exemption, let's say you had 2 noise reports from experts. One said there was no noise impact. one said there was, then let's assume that the one saying there's no noise impact was substantial evidence and was well prepared, then that's substantial evidence and the project's eligible for an exemption. But if the project's not eligible for an exemption and you have these two noise reports, then the noise report saying that the project has a noise impact, well, that's substantial evidence that the project may have an environmental impact.
Okay, thank you. Councilmember Risto, I think I might have skipped over you if you'd like to ask a question.
Thank you, Mayor. Just kind of simple. I think we're touching on it, but I was thinking about the fact that, when we had the General Plan 2040, we had a large number of units that were studied in the EIR, looking at the cumulative impact of our housing element and the builder's remedy projects. They're not necessarily landing in the same places, and the densities are spikier. And so, I think about the fact that our service providers, Valley Water looks at our general plans, said we have water plans for that. I'm not as concerned about that as I am for something like West Valley Sanitation, where maybe you've got, wastewater lines running in certain areas that may be anticipated 30 to 40 units an acre in certain places, but now all of a sudden, if in certain corridors of town, we're getting up to 160 dwelling units an acre, what if that requires new infrastructure? I mean, that almost seems infeasible, or who pays for that?
Yeah, interestingly, one of the exceptions to the vesting is that if mitigation measures need to be applied to mitigate environmental impacts. So even if the town could require mitigation measures for that, and I think it would depend on the facts about what, to the extent to which the sewer line needs to be increased, what the cost would be, who shares that. I mean, I don't think you could predict right now how that would work out. But if the environmental review showed that there was inadequate sewer lines, then the city could require some kind of mitigation.
Thank you. So that would not be grounds to turn it down. It would be, this can only happen if the sewer line gets revamped in this entire area, and developer, you have to pay for it?
Projects can be turned down if there's inadequate water or sewer facilities. I'm not aware of anybody, who has applied that, but that is one of the standards.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
I'm just going to ask a quick follow-on to that. If an area is under water restriction, meaning that the water that you're allowed to use has been reduced, does that signify that there's inadequate water?
The language is that the water or sewer facilities are inadequate. So I think you would have to demonstrate that the facilities are inadequate.
Okay, thank you. Vice Mayor?
Thank you. Thanks a ton for your presentation. I think it's very helpful. Always provides clarity and perhaps some alarm. So there had been a lot of back and forth on whether a municipality's housing element is considered compliant when the town or city declares it compliant, or when the State Housing and Community Development Department declares it compliant. And there had been back and forth on that over the last year. And then so your presentation referenced a variety of new impacts from much of it, I think, is new state housing law, AB 1893. And so my understanding is that AB 1893 puts that question to bed. And it says that the housing element is compliant when the state says it is compliant. But you said there's some legal uncertainty there. So I had two questions on this. So can you share just a little bit more about what that part of AB 1893 means for the housing element in Los Gatos? And then also, because I'm not aware of any legal challenges to that law, are you foreseeing that there could be some, or are there any that are, coming up?
Let's see, it was AB 1886 that had that one. Sorry, it doesn't really matter because I think they're all a big package. So there's disagreement about whether it applied before January 1st, despite the language saying it was declaratory of existing law. So we have so there's one case right now at the Court of Appeal. I haven't seen the brief, so I'm not sure what they're arguing, but it involves Redondo Beach. And there's a number of issues it's a builder's remedy case, and there's a number of issues in the case that don't involve Los Gatos, like dealing with the Coastal Commission. But one of the issues is that the developer submitted their preliminary application between the time the city adopted a housing element and the time that HCD approved it. And in that particular case, the trial court held that the project, that the housing element was adequate when adopted. There's also a couple trial court cases in LA which disagree, but in that particular one, they upheld what Redondo Beach had done, particularly because HCD had already said your housing element's adequate when it was adopted. So that's, I think, one of the issues that's being reviewed. Now, that has to do with a housing element that HCD said was okay. Another issue in the trial court, though, was that the developer was also challenging HCD's view that the housing element was compliant and arguing that the housing element was not compliant despite HCD's finding.
Thank you. Let me see if there's any down here. Yes, Commissioner Raspy.
Thank you, Mayor. I wanted to follow up on Commissioner Stump's question or comment regarding the cumulative impact analysis. Now, as I understand that, what that would do would, rather than evaluate each project individually, it would take, for instance, all the 14 Builders Remedies projects and analyze, by way of example, traffic, how all those projects together would impact the town. Is that a fair kind of summary of what that would do?
Yes.
Thank you. And perhaps this is an unfair question. How long would it take to prepare such a project? What would the expense be, and who would pay for that? Does that shifted to the developers and then divided among the developers? Just some kind of practical questions or answers to questions, if we have those answers. Thank you.
Yeah, I think at this point, we don't know how long it would take or how much it would cost. The law does provide that applicants do need to pay for the cost of the environmental study. I think there's one builder's remedy project that has already gone to Planning Commission. And so but as a general rule, the applicant pays for the analysis.
I appreciate that. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Yes, Chair Thomas.
Thank you. I have a follow-up, so I appreciate it. So then the question is, if there was a cumulative impact analysis, then what happens with those results? Does it just mean that there still is they just have to, but there will be more included in the mitigated negative declarations, or what happens next after a cumulative analysis? How is that?
It would become part of the record, and the grounds for denial or conditioning of a builder's remedy project would remain the same under the Housing Accountability Act. It would still be those 5 factors, but the environmental analysis might inform whether or not any of those 5 factors are present.
Okay, thank you. Councilmember Badami?
I would also like to follow up on Planning Commissioner Chair Thomas and Commissioner Raspy on that. So let's say that we have an application before us. Can we, before we get it before us for a hearing, can we suspend the application until a cumulative impact analysis is complete?
In my opinion, yes, because that would be part of the environmental analysis, and a decision can't be made until the decision maker has the environmental analysis before them.
Okay, but we don't know how long it might take to get one done, so it could be months?
I think that's a reasonable assumption.
Okay, just saying. Thank you.
Okay, did I miss somebody down here? Yes, Commissioner Barnett.
Thank you. Referring to slide 8, can you give us a little more information concerning the base density calculation as it relates to Los Gatos? And
Oh, how the base density is calculated?
yes, please.
Under the builder's remedy. So a project is entitled to a minimum of 1.5 times what's called the default density. If you remember, you had to zone sites at least 30 units an acre to change for, to have them count as as suitable for lower income housing. So somebody then gets at least 45 units an acre. Then, if the project is located in a high opportunity or very high opportunity area, there's certain maps that the town Tax Credit Allocation Commission has prepared. You can look online, but the entire town of Los Gatos is a high opportunity or very high opportunity area. So they get 35, so any site gets additional 35 units an acre. So that's the minimum density in the town. Another way of calculating it, if a site is already zoned at 30 units an acre, it gets 3 times the density, 90 plus 35 or 125. Anyway, it goes way up, but every site gets at least 80 units an acre.
That's helpful. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to go to the Vice Mayor and then Commissioner Stump, and then we're going to go to public, and then there'll be another round for the council and the planning commissioners. So go ahead.
Thank you, Mayor. So going on the point of this cumulative impacts analysis, so could you talk about the legal exposure to pursuing that path? Because I trying to understand how, if the town chose to delay holding a public hearing, an applicant could take legal action against the town. Is that a possibility?
I would say it's always a possibility. The Permit Streamlining Act does impose deadlines on local agencies to consider applications, but those deadlines start kicking in at the point that the CEQA is complete. Do you have anything else?
Yeah, they've created another definition of effective disapproval, where if the town doesn't approve an exemption to which a project is entitled, then an applicant have to go through certain steps to do it. But that is another potential bit of litigation.
And so just a quick follow-up. So there could be a dispute over whether or not an applicant is entitled to that exemption.
Right. Also, somebody could, I guess, challenge the council's determination that, this supplemental EIR needs to be done. And what the city needs, the town needs, is to have substantial evidence that there may be additional impacts.
Got it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I think we may want to explore that a little deeper after we get public comment, but Commissioner Stump, go ahead.
Thank you. This is really a follow-up to the Vice Mayor's line of questioning around the January 30, 2023 resolution. Based on what I see, because we also referenced it again on June 4th of 2024 in a resolution that said we were in substantial compliance with state housing element law, I assume that resolution is still in force. If that were the case, my question would be, what or who authorized our staff to begin taking builders, SB 330 applications invoking builder's remedy? What was the trigger for that to take place? Because clearly we were going on record that we were in substantial compliance with housing law.
So the builder's remedy kicks in at the point at which the decision makers are deciding whether to approve, deny, or condition a project. So it's not a grounds for a local agency to refuse to process an application, but it is a basis for the ultimate decision that gets made. Does that answer your question?
So that means even at this date, we could challenge builder's remedy, or we could challenge that we were substantially compliant with the state housing element, and we would no longer be processing those applications under builder's remedy if we prevailed.
Well, the town would always process the applications,
Right.
but the 5 reasons for denial kick in at the time that the town is making its decision on the project. So it's not a grounds to say, I'm sorry, we can't accept your application. It's a grounds to render the ultimate decision.
I'm going to just ask one question of my own, then we're going to go to public questions. And that related to that, has there been any judicial history on municipalities challenging that aspect of certification that their housing element was substantially complete?
You mean challenging HCD finding that the project, that their housing element did not comply with state
Yes.
law? Yeah, there's a couple of trial court cases where particularly the La Cañada Flint Ridge cases, where the city tried to argue that its housing element was in compliance with state law, but trial court didn't agree.
There's just one case, or there are other municipalities that are challenging that as well?
I'm not aware of any other cases where someone has challenged, and recently, there's older cases, but they've changed the standards, but I'm not aware of any recent cases where someone has argued that a housing element that HCD did not find in compliance was in compliance. In fact, we're representing 2 cities where groups are challenging HCD-approved housing elements.
I see. Okay, thank you. So we're gonna come back to the council and commission questions. I have one card. I do want to take public comment. This would be considered verbal communications, which would be comments about this agenda item. And so if anyone would like to make a comment or ask a question, we'll try to get those answered right now as we go through them. So I have one card, Ming Wei. If you'd like to speak, please come up.
Hi, I have a very quick question. It's like from the infill exemption, it says no impacts on traffic. I'd like to understand how the traffic impact is being conducted, because as everyone know, Los Gatos town is being super crowded. And when the traffic analysis will be done, is this through the the normal time where everyone's go to work and after school, or it's during the rush hour? Because every morning when we're sending our child to the school, it be super crowded along the Los Gatos Boulevard. It has 2 elementary school, 1 middle school, and 1 high schools. And also specific talking to the no impact, how is the no impact to the traffic being conducted from the environmental studies? Like what is standard? Because for example, specifically talking to the project number 13 on the Oka Road, it only has 1 ingress and 1 egress. And it says to be a 135 unit with 270 cars being allowed. But that road has already been fully packed with 2 Los Gatos Gardens, with the the Bonneville Park there, and also 2 Jewish community center, as well as swimming racket clubs, and all the residents living inside the overpass. Several years ago, there's a fire event in the Los Gatos Gardens, completely blocked the road. We've been waiting there outside for more than half hours because the road being completely blocked, and we've been having to wait in the car or walking inside the residence area. Also, in this year, on the January 8th, there's another accident that a car rushed over the overpass and rushed down to the congestion area, and the police department just blocked me for getting to my house for 10 minutes because they have to handle this situation. What if there's some emergency situation happening inside, and then all the residents being blocked from going in and out? What is the plan for study to justify this no impact to the traffic or environmental report? Also, there's the Los Gatos Creek right behind the project. And what is the the studies and the potential impact that could be conducted? Thank you.
Okay, thank you for your question and comments. And I just want to remind folks that this session was noticed as a study session about the state law and builder's remedy. And so we will not be able to discuss specific projects during this session, but I believe that you had a couple of questions that were more about state law, and so I wonder if staff would like to answer those. I think they were related to traffic, when traffic studies are supposed to be conducted, and what does it mean to have no impact?
Well, the state changed the whole way that cities are allowed to do traffic studies under the California Environmental Quality Act. And so rather than looking at congestion, cities are supposed to look at impacts by what's called VMT, vehicle miles traveled. And since multifamily buildings generally have fewer trips per capita, so it tends to favor multifamily buildings. Now, you can also look at various safety issues. Safety issues also fall, but traffic congestion, which is what most of us experience, is not considered an environmental impact anymore, at least under the California Environmental Quality Act.
Yeah, thank you for that. That is important information for, I think, people to understand. So the next card I have is from Rachel Hinojosa, and if you'd like to make comments or questions, thank you.
I do have a question regarding the process of CEQA. As I read, I found a typewritten document from like 1984.
Could you speak a little closer to the microphone? That'd be helpful. Thank you.
Here you go. So my question is, do the people in the town have the ability to comment on and request aspects that they would like to see in the CEQA process? I have found one town, I couldn't find it in our town's description, but it was that there was like a public forum where people could come and talk and state things that they wanted to see in the environmental impact report.
Thank you for that question. I'm going to ask if staff could address that, and particularly maybe expand a little bit to EIR versus other environmental documents that might be prepared.
Mm-hmm.
Are there opportunities
I'll
for the
start,
public to speak?
and then the town's community development director may jump in as well. So when the town does an environmental impact report, and when other cities do environmental impact reports, there's occasionally a scoping session, and at the scoping session, members of the public will talk about information they would like to see included. With regard to whenever an exemption is used or when an initial study leads to the conclusion that there will be a negative declaration or a mitigated negative declaration, the negative declaration does get circulated for review, and then there's an opportunity at the meeting at which the project is being considered for members of the public to come and speak about the particular project that was reviewed. And then with regard to projects in general, members of the public can always email the project planner that's working on that particular project with their concerns.
Okay, thank you. Next card is Jeff Lockridge, followed by Karen Yamamoto.
Yeah, I have a few questions, and I'm sure that they might not be able to answer right this second, but it might filter into other people's questions. First of all, my overall point has to do with a question about the state itself and their imposition of these mandates in the first place. And the reason I'm saying that is because only the town councils from all the towns, or the city councils, can get together in some sort of a class action suit that would challenge some of these, this is my words, this bureaucratic mandates that are coming across. Because it's not Gavin Newsom that's putting this down on paper. It's a bureaucracy that is below that, and they're not elected, and there's no way that we can get rid of them. That we can. I mean, there has to be some sort of a voice there. Anyway, that's my first question, first statement. Agricultural land. Is there an agricultural land designation on any part? I'm not talking about any particular project, but I'm just wondering if there is, then that should be. I saw it up there, so let's see. My feeling about all of this is that this is a rather complicated process and a really complicated situation, and it would make sense to me, and I realize it's cutting to the quick, but rather than talk about all the things that we can't do, why don't we talk about the shorter list of the things that we can do, and whether it's the town council doing it or it's the residents. And if none of those things, if the list is so short that no resident can do anything, then let us know, because there's a lot of upset residents now. And there's a lot of smart people in this town who can come up with possible solutions where, like right now, the questions and answers are interesting, and sometimes they result in something that no one's ever thought of before. I don't believe that, but I can't believe that. And the last thing is, what's considered unusual if you're talking about, and unfortunately I'll expand it to 6, 7, and 13-story buildings. If that's not considered unusual, I don't know what is. In a town that has only allowed 3 stories, and when it went higher than that, it resulted in litigation against the town, against the residents, and that's all I have to say.
Okay, thank you. We're going to try to get through these. The first question about state imposition of mandates. Does staff have any comment about that?
I mean, all I would say is I think these laws were primarily passed by elected officials. You know, many of us complain about HCD and their interpretations, but all this, you know, all this really comes from the city's elected officials.
Yeah, thank you. And I would point out that our local elected senator and assembly member voted for these laws. So the other next question was, are there any agricultural lands designated, and we don't need to comment on specific projects, but perhaps as the group of developments that we are seeing, do we know whether agricultural land is involved in these?
I don't believe so.
Okay, thank you. And then I'm going to go to the last question. It was really a drill down on, I think, a follow-up from Councilmember Badami is what is considered unusual? Would not a 13-story building adjacent to single-family homes be unusual?
Well, for me, it seems unusual. I mean, I think generally the courts say they will uphold a city's decision on whether circumstances are unusual if you've got substantial evidence. And as the commissioner nicely pointed out, substantial evidence is facts, reasonable assumptions based on facts, or expert opinion supported by facts. You need, make findings.
Okay, thank you. And then the last one, is there a way that we can focus on what we can do? And I will have some questions later about health and safety denials or modifications, but are there some areas of what we can do?
I think CEQA is one area where the town has some control, and then also those 5 findings that were on the slide that are the grounds, the permissible grounds for denying or conditioning a project.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Paulson, I think you were about to say something.
Thank you. Just for the record, we do have a couple areas in town that are agriculture. And so those processes, and one of them was the first phase of the North 40. So they do an evaluation and make a determination as to whether or not it would be an impact. So any other sites in town that are under similar ag based on state or federal maps will also go through that analysis.
Okay, thank you. Karen Yamamoto, and then Noah Sklar.
Can you hear me okay? All right, I have several questions. Where do I start? Most of my questions are regarding CEQA and how they impact some of the developments, all of the developments, specifically sewer lines. When residential sewer lines and retail or business sewer lines run parallel to each other within a 10 to 20 foot proximity to each other. Is that a CEQA? And who pays for that if trees are removed and damages? If a builder is building a building and they're taking out trees that could damage the sewer line to residential, is the residential, who is it CEQA that actually looks into that, and who pays for that? Is that going to be the resident? Is that going to be the builder? Is that going to be the town? Is that, I mean, that's my question there. As far as CEQA goes, how does Governor Newsom's new pausing CEQA affect all of these builds? And then another question is, does an evacuation route, a main evacuation route, part of what CEQA looks into as far as safety concerns and hazards, especially when one evacuation route is being heavily developed and it also leads to a hospital? Oh, and one more thing, since I have time. There are 21 SB and AB housing laws that our government has put in effect regarding housing and how we are to be impacted. I think it's time citizens unite together and to work together to get our government officials to recognize this is not okay and you're putting our lives at risk. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So would staff like to address first the question about sewer lines when commercial and residential may be in parallel?
I'll take a stab at that. So it sounded like the question was, what if the sewer lines are damaged in the course of construction? And so there would typically be a condition of approval that would require the developer to repair any damage that they caused.
I assume that would apply to trees as well, which I think was the second question. And you said the developer would be responsible, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And then the next one was a question about pausing CEQA. Is that the case? And would that affect any of this?
If memory serves, and I'd have to confirm this, I think that was specific to the property that was affected in the LA wildfires, and so it doesn't change the town's CEQA processes.
Okay, and that's something you may want to follow up with later. And then the last one I heard was, is evacuation route, are evacuation routes a CEQA consideration?
Yes, they are.
Under what area would that fall?
Generally under safety, I think. But there's questions about evacuation routes, I think, in the initial study. I can't remember exactly which section.
Thank you. Okay, Noah Sklar, and then Amy Despars, and that's the last card I have, and then we will go to Zoom after that.
Hey, hi, I'm Noah Sklar. I don't mean to sound redundant because the wise people before me have spoken. First of all, I'm in shock to see 14 developments. I guess I'm detached or something. This is going to turn into Sunnyvale. No disrespect to Sunnyvale, but this quaint town is going down with these developments. But I have to be specific. I apologize about one project that is related to me, and it's falling under the unusual project. I think it's the Oka Road, and yes, one way in, one way out. This is a safety and fire hazard, period, period, period. In and out, only one way, one way.
In order not to jeopardize the town's ultimate decision on that project, my recommendation is you come back to the public hearing at which the Oka project will be considered, and then you could provide your comments at that public hearing.
Okay, okay, so I have one question. The analysis, the traffic report analysis that the development, the developer or the applicant has to come, how do you make sure it's not biased? Like, we cannot afford doing our residents our own study. So how does it work? Like, he's going to come up with the study. How do you know it's not biased, basically?
Okay, thank you. So would staff like to talk about how the CEQA process maintains objectivity?
Yeah, I'll start, and then the community development director can fill in if I miss anything. But the developer funds the studies, and then the town contracts with the consultants, and so the town is reviewing the work product.
Thank you, Mayor. So there's kind of two paths depending on which consultants we're talking about. Sometimes the developer prepares their own, and in that case, it is peer reviewed by our consultant. And so that is the case for those technical studies. And so that's how we eliminate bias. So we have that checked.
Okay, thank you. And without getting into any specific projects, I wanted to ask the question about whether the egress and ingress considerations, particularly if there is something related to safety having to do with one way in and one way out, would that be a CEQA consideration, or would that be a consideration of the project itself?
I'll start, and then if Barbara or town attorney have anything to add. So County Fire is reviewing all of these applications. And so if and when an issue comes up, the most recent one is a project that has already been acted upon, which required an emergency ingress egress, an additional one. Different circumstances for that one, but fire is evaluating those. And then the other is, I'll look to see, I want to say in 2019, in October, there was some discussion of things like evacuation routes and maybe creating an evacuation plan. And so to my knowledge, that has not been done. I think that gets back to some of Ms. Couts and Ms. Whalen's previous comments of adopted standards from a health and safety standpoint that are objective. So I'm not aware of those, but evacuation routes is, as Ms. Couts mentioned, one of the items that's addressed in the initial study checklist.
Okay, thank you. Amy Despars, and then we'll take any questions from Zoom after that.
I wasn't really planning on talking tonight, but the more we sit here, the more we learn and the more we have to question. About the fire evaluating, I have a question with the fire county, did you say county fire department, are evaluating projects singly, but are they evaluating what it's going to look like with all of these projects? Because I think it's one thing to look at one and it's going to affect here and one and it's going to affect here, but if you look at all of them together and what's going to happen, I think we need to look at the big picture. I'm also interested to know if any of you were aware that, I'm going to have to read off this, sorry. Working with Google researchers, the city of Mill Valley participated in a groundbreaking simulation of a full evacuation of all greater city and county families living west of Highway 101. They used actual street configurations with garages and streets. There was a sobering impact in understanding specific evacuation times, which vary greatly by neighborhood. Although we have indisputable data from Mill Valley, this is an issue for all communities in California, with housing in high fire zones and challenging evacuation routes, just like we are here. Wildfire is unpredictable, we know that. So in their study, at the 2-hour mark, the simulation predicts that 78% of all passengers in the 17,000 car Greater Mill Valley simulation will reach a safer location due to much better traffic planning. But 1,500 cars of the 3,300 cars with occupants in these combined neighborhoods are not expected to reach a safer area within 2 hours. I actually saw the burned out cars in Paradise, and when I think of our town, that's what I fear for with all of this. And I think that is a huge safety that I think we all need to really look at. This is us. We have 1- and 2-lane roads. Are we looking at a simulation like this to see what our evacuation looks like? So that's my question. Obviously, seeing it, it's very powerful. You never want to see it on the news is one thing, but driving through is another. So I think it's really important we look at what other cities are doing. And I know you all are trying, but there's a lot out there. Along with where I got that information, it is a petition for people to be signing. If you're on my email distribution list, you received it. And it's signing for high fire communities to be able to fight all of these huge housing developments. And I know someone else suggested everybody working together, and I've said it before at many town council meetings, but we do have our neighborhood voices, Stop the Madness, and it's neighborhoods across the state of California, a grassroots effort. I can turn this way, right, because it's not town council, so I highly recommend you looking into that. It's called Our Neighborhood Voices. So thank you.
Thank you very much. So I heard a couple of questions, one related to county fire and cumulative effects. Is county fire looking at cumulative, or are they looking at only individual applications?
Thank you, Mayor. So County Fire has reviewed at a minimum one time all of the current 14 projects. So if and when they bring up an issue related to that, then we would have the applicants address it. To my knowledge, there haven't been any issues other than, again, the case by case, as with the ingress egress that was required of a project that was recently approved. And then staff will also check in with County Fire and get some input from them on the cumulative question.
Okay, thank you. So we'll keep that as one to follow up. And then with regard to the concern about evacuation times, are things like evacuation, ability to evacuate, and routes for evacuation, are those things that can be evaluated with an application, and do they require a simulation or a study, or is there any method for looking at safe evacuation from wildfire?
As we said, there is a question in the in the initial study, the standard initial study checklist about whether a project would impair an adopted emergency response plan or an emergency evacuation plan. In terms of what, how that's done, I'm not sure, so maybe Joel could respond to that.
Thank you. That touches on what I mentioned before. We don't have an evacuation plan adopted. So I think that's the key component. So that might be something, I think many people are familiar with the model that Ms. Despars mentioned. You know, that's great. But I think we need to probably ultimately get direction from council as far as what next steps might look like and what that effort would entail.
Thank you. I think there may be a difference of opinion about whether evacuation routes have been identified or not. I certainly found evidence of evacuation routes for both fire and for flood, but whether they're adequate and whether they consist of a plan, I think there may be some differences of opinion there. So is there anyone on Zoom that would have a question?
There are no hands raised on Zoom.
Okay, so I'm going to close the public comment and go back to commissioners and council members. And so if there's anyone who hasn't asked a question yet who'd like to jump in, happy to take that, or whoever does have a question. Okay. Vice Mayor, see your hand again.
Thank you. Yeah, so question for Ms. Couch. So I think I'm seeing sort of two competing I don't know, lines of thinking or ways to think about what we're dealing with here. So I think tonight we've heard a variety of potential avenues of gaining some leverage in the decision-making process, CEQA or unusual circumstances, or a variety of other things that have been thoughtfully shared by the public. But you know, when we did this hearing about the study session about a year ago, I wrote it down because I found your words particularly chilling when, you know, because a lot of folks ask the council, planning commission, et cetera, why doesn't Los Gatos sue the state? Why doesn't the town council just deny these applications, right? That's often something I hear. And quoting from your presentation, you shared that in general, the courts have been very pro-housing, uphold housing approvals, and overturn housing denials, and that the risks to the town of Los Gatos are significant, including significant attorney's fees, exposure, high legal defense costs, and possible compensation for damages. And you cited the cities of Berkeley, Huntington Beach, and others. And so could you help us square sort of these competing, you know, risks that I think the town is weighing here?
I mean, the landscape is frankly, you know, the legal landscape is frankly very tilted toward the approval of housing projects. I mean, what I said before hasn't not really changed. You know, CEQA remains something that the city can use to try to understand the impacts of the projects, possibly be able to attach mitigation measures. But, you know, it's unclear to what extent, let's see, how can I say this? It's unclear what the ultimate result would be. You know, CEQA is basically an information tool, right? Every court decision that you read, every CEQA case starts with, CEQA is an informational document, and the point is to give people all the information. So if the city, you know, if there's issues now where the city doesn't have adequate information, it can get it. What the ultimate result will be in terms of each individual project is hard to predict.
Okay, and then a follow-up on that. So talking about the cumulative impacts analysis, you shared that the town needs to prove that this analysis is necessary. What does that process look like?
I mean, typically it involves somebody doing something like an initial study, right? That's usually what the substantial evidence is. So in this case, because there's already some CEQA, it would need to be demonstrated that it's not adequate.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Yes, Commissioner Raspy.
Thank you, Mayor. One follow-up. One of our public commentators talked about getting public input into the CEQA process. And Barbara, I think you also mentioned that that's, I think, a useful device to bring people into the process earlier. And I think on the Planning Commission, we've noticed we have better projects ultimately when the public is involved in those things. Town Council indicated that we use scoping sessions for those. And I guess my question to that is, who decides which projects have scoping sessions? Is there a way to require developments to have scoping sessions so that there is more public input and information at earlier stages?
Well, a scoping session is pretty typical if an EIR is being done. So if the city decides to do a supplemental EIR, say on cumulative impacts, a scoping session would be pretty routine. Now, the states put a limit on the number of hearings that cities can have, five hearings per project. So you'd want to consider that. Typically, though, a scoping session is only required if an individual project has an EIR.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Okay, thank you. Commissioner Birch.
There was a follow-up to that. If it was a cumulative study, so it was multiple projects, so it's not tied to one specific development, and that the town was taking, would that count as one of the hearings for a project if it's more of a cumulative study that we're doing over multiple projects?
I think we'd have to look into that a little bit further.
Commissioner Stump.
I'd like to come back to the January 30th resolution again, because I realize that we've made a determination, I suppose, not to test that in the courts. And my question would be, if we tested that in the courts and against all odds we were to prevail, what impact would that have on the applications that we have in process right now?
That would mean that the fifth finding that was on that slide of the 5 reasons that a project can be conditioned or denied would be satisfied.
Again, is there any examples or record of testing that with in the courts?
Well, I think, as I said, I'm not aware, aside from the La Cañada case, I'm not aware of anybody challenging recently, because the older cases more so. I'm not aware of anybody challenging recently state finding that the housing element was not consistent with state law. I might add, in terms of the town attorney's decision about being able to turn down projects because of, if they didn't comply with the city's zoning. But remember, not all the projects rely on the very high densities that the builder's remedy allows. And for those that don't need that density, the density bonus laws also allow the kind of height increases that you've seen.
Thank you. I wanted to open up one other area, and that's the discussion about health and safety basis for denial or requiring modification. Are there some examples of health and safety issues that have come up that have resulted in a denial or modification, and have those been sustained through the process regarding, particularly regarding builder's remedy?
There's some old cases where that was sustained, but they've, really tightened up the language. So I looked for another client. There were 3 trial court cases in LA where cities made health and safety findings, none of which were upheld. Now, to make a health and safety finding, you need to have an objective standard, an objective health and safety standard. You need to show that the project violated the standard. You need to show that the violation created a health and safety impact, and you need to show that it can't be mitigated. So in 2 of the cases, the court said you're not citing any objective standard. And in the third case, there was a fire code standard, but in that one, the court disagreed with the fire chief about whether whether the standard was in fact violated. Also, in each of the cases, they complained that the city hadn't made findings that the impact could not be mitigated. So you have to have all four of those factors in order to have a case stand up. I'm dealing with a city where there's an issue about providing a sidewalk on a busy road. That might be one where possibly you could make those findings.
Okay, and so some examples of objective standards, would that be something like setbacks?
It's an objective standard, but it would be hard to define it as a health. How would you define it as a health and safety standard?
Well, I don't want to get into a specific project. But,
No, I'm not even talking. I'm just
But that could be a possibility because setbacks were put in place for safety reasons in the first place in many cases. So
you'd need to to explain why it's a safety standard and so forth.
Okay, and then if I could follow up on that, the safety, I think the wording is adopted objective public health and safety standards. Does that include not only local objective standards, but state and federal standards as well?
There's a separate finding you can make if a project doesn't conform with state or federal law. Let's see. You can make a finding that the denial is required to comply with specific state or federal law, and there's no feasible method to comply without rendering the development unaffordable to low and moderate income households.
Okay, thank you. Yes, Commissioner Birch.
Just as a follow-up.
Should say, I'm sorry, Vice Chair Birch.
Fine. But to follow up with what you were just asking, right, because I think this has come up before, the health and safety, Ms. Whelan, does the town of Los Gatos have any objective standards in writing around health and safety that we would be able to utilize?
I'll start, and then the community development director can follow on. To my knowledge, the only objective standards the town would have would be in the fire code or the building code.
But I would say it's fair to say that some of those standards were put in place for safety reasons, correct?
That's correct.
Okay, thanks. Councilmember Risto.
Thank you. Before we were talking about projects that came in that between the time when we adopted our housing element and then eventually the state certified it, where projects came in, some of them with in areas that were not zoned for housing, et cetera, where clearly that's a builder's remedy project. But we go ahead and we process these, and then we have to determine if the builder's remedy applies or if we're going to turn it down based on that. Similarly, what would happen right now, because we clearly have a certified housing element on the state side, if a project came in that looked like it didn't fit anything, does staff process that? I mean, it sounds like by the same logic, no matter what comes in, we process it and then determine if it meets our standards as it goes along or after it's brought to a hearing?
I'll defer to the community development director.
So right now we're processing the applications we have, and so we would continue to do that, but we would also be seeking the advice of legal counsel as well to see what, if any, options there were.
Thank you. Vice Mayor.
Generally, state law, there have been cases where the state, that the refusal to even process an application is viewed as an effective moratorium or effective denial. So if somebody came in, let's say with 300 units an acre and a 30-story building and filed a preliminary application, I mean, they could do it, but it would effectively be meaningless, right? Because they would just be vesting your standards, which don't allow that. So that at some point, then, if they actually chose to come in with a real application, a formal application, then you could make it decide how you wanted to handle it. Yeah.
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, yeah, because to follow on, we've certainly had projects that seemed like they were builder's remedy, but it turns out they didn't need to use the builder's remedy to get what they wanted because of density. So there certainly can be projects coming forward in the future that don't necessarily align with what we envisioned when we created our housing element, but because of state density bonus and other things are going to exceed what we planned, correct? Okay, thank you.
Okay. One other question I had was, are there any circumstances under which additional builder's remedy applications could be legitimately processed?
Yeah, the language about the definition of a builder's remedy project is that the city's housing element was inadequate either at the time the application was made or after. So HCD periodically threatens to decertify, I guess would be the term, a city's housing element. And so then if somebody had come in with a preliminary application that hadn't yet expired, I guess they could change it to be a builder's remedy. So that's a serious threat if HCD should make it.
Okay, thank you. Vice Mayor?
Thank you. So as some folks in the community might have read in the news, the town of Los Gatos recently filed declaratory relief with Superior Court to resolve uncertainty around aspects of state housing law. And so for the town attorney, at a high level, could you share a little bit about the implications of this action and how this could impact what we're talking about here?
So we talked a little bit about SB 330, which authorizes applicants to submit a preliminary application, and that the preliminary application vests those applicants to the standards that were in effect at the time the application was submitted. The state law provides that after you've submitted a preliminary application, you have 180 days to follow on with your formal planning application. And that after that, you have an additional 90-day period in which to render your planning application complete. In Los Gatos, there are certain projects that did vest to 2 90-day periods. And the statute further provides that if that period has been exceeded, the vesting expires. And so the project would no longer be vested to the earlier standards. The statute, it's interesting. I mean, many cities and towns read the statute to provide for a single 90-day period in which to render your application complete based on the use of the word "the." However, there are others who read it to apply to provide for recurring 90-day periods for an indefinite period of time. And so the purpose of the litigation is to get resolution on that question.
Thank you very much.
Other questions? Yes, Commissioner Barnett.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Early in our discussion, you mentioned the issue of the town attorney rendering an opinion about cumulative impacts as being dependent on a third-party preparer, CEQA expert. And I guess my question is, what sequence of events would be necessary to get to that point? So, it's assumed that the town council would have to make a decision to hire such a consultant, and perhaps that would be, requiring a bid process. But are there other elements that would be involved in this process of making cumulative impacts a legal reality in our town? Thank you.
We've only recently started discussing this possibility internally, so I don't have details to offer this evening, but I could follow up with more information to this group.
That'd be useful. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes. Commissioner Burnett.
Oh, thank you. So question, when you came last year and we had this joint commission and planning and council meeting, you brought up the importance of having an updated objective design guideline, especially how it pertains to the density bonus law. So could you speak to that? Because we are working on our objective design guidelines. There's areas in that could have some impact and some control over some of the architectural design. And I remember you speaking of how important that was.
Yeah, unfortunately, there have been court decisions which basically sort of really undermine cities' objective design standards. I mean, I think they can be useful in terms of giving applicants, you know, a sense of what this town really wants. But there was a case about density bonus waivers, which you might know are waivers of development standards, and they're unlimited. And the court said that you have to grant waivers for a building as designed. So effectively, it allows somebody, if they choose, to ignore many of the objective standards. So, which is, you know, quite unfortunate. But, you know, I think they can give applicants a sense of, you know, perhaps how to make their approval process easier.
Thank you.
As a follow-up to that, could some of the objective standards address health and safety issues? Perhaps
course,
those,
yeah.
perhaps those are ones that would be more productive to pursue. Okay, Vice Mayor.
Thank you. So in the spirit of trying to get more creative, I wanted to talk a little bit about what power the town of Los Gatos has to negotiate with developers and how that process works. And so I think sort of one part of that is how can those discussions legally be initiated? And then what sort of tools do we have? I know the town has talked about and utilized things like tolling agreements and development agreements in the past. And so what sort of measures do we have to be able to meet in the middle with developers?
Any staff member can talk to the member of the applicant's team that they're working with about the project and how certain decisions were made. If a council member were talking to an applicant, it wouldn't be out of bounds to ask why certain decisions were made about the project. And so there's always a conversation that can happen between the applicant and town representatives. And then in terms of tools, I would say a tolling agreement is a tool. I would say referring people to the density bonus law is a tool. And that's what comes to mind for me.
I had one on, go ahead.
I think another incentive for developers is any kind of litigation for the developers, whether from the town or from the community, really delays a project, makes it much more difficult to, you know, to build. And if the developer is serious about wanting to proceed with the project, you know, possibly some kind of compromise might be in the developer's interest.
Can I ask one quick follow-on on that?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so that I would think that the biggest risk to the developers is the uncertainty in this process from the town's perspective, right? That if we chose to deny project X, despite that, and they could sue us, right? And we might be in the wrong in the court's eyes, but we have, we would have the potential to delay the project by potentially years. And so it seems to me that avenues that we have to introduce, more certainty into the process by helping developers better understand what we expect of them would, potentially be of benefit to them. So are those tools, the development agreement, the tolling agreement, are those really the ones we have to introduce certainty? Is that, do we have anything else?
Yeah, a development agreement, of course, is referendable and is a legislative act, so a developer may or may not view that as desirable. But a development agreement, yeah, that's about the only way you can introduce real certainty into the process. I mean, the fact is that the preliminary applications have given developers many of the benefits of a development agreement at a much, much easier, with much less effort than was previously required. There's also something called a vesting tentative map, which has some of the advantages of a development agreement.
Thank you.
Commissioner Stump?
Mayor, this is sort of a process request. Maybe when we're concluding the meeting, if we could just review the action items that we've identified this evening and get them on a list so that they're before us.
Okay, thank you for your input on that. I did want to come back to CEQA, and I wanted to understand what is the governing CEQA review for the set of builder's remedy projects that we have. Is it the 2040 General Plan, EIR? Is it the 2015 Housing Element? Is it the sites under the current Housing Element? What is our view on what is the governing CEQA review?
The 2040 land use and community design elements were referended, and so the 2020 land use or rescinded by the council, and so the 2020 land use and community design elements are in effect. And so for any issues that are covered in those two elements, it would be the environmental document for the 2020 general plan. And for all of the other elements, it would be the 2040 general plan EIR.
So the numbers of units studied in the land use element, is that from the 2020 general plan or the 2040 general plan?
I don't have the answer to that this evening.
Okay, that one I think is very important to follow up on. So I'm going to just do sort of a last call for questions. Councilmember Badami?
How reasonable is that with the 2015 housing element that is so different from the housing element that we just adopted, or what would be studied as part of the governing document to study the new projects? Because I think what we just outlined is we're using the 2020 land use element, but that also includes the 2015 housing element and the numbers from that. Is that correct?
Can anyone else help with the answer to that?
My understanding is that when the city approved the current housing element, the 2024 housing element, it tiered it off the 2040 general plan EIR, correct? So there was environmental review done on the current housing element. So the current housing element would be one of the documents, even though it's inconsistent, I guess, in places with the 2020 land use element, which probably needs to be updated at some point too, to be consistent with the housing element.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's important to have that information, so that one would be, again, one we'd want to follow up in writing. Any further questions? Okay. So at this point, we are not going to ask for a summary of everything we've learned, but maybe the town attorney would like to make some comments about how we will follow up from this session.
Yes, a video of this session will be uploaded to the town's website, and then we will prepare a summary of the questions and answers that can be posted to the town's website. And that would probably take longer than posting the video. I'm going to estimate a week or two.
Okay, and so summary of questions and answers, that would include the items that Commissioner Stump had asked for. Is that correct?
Do you mean next steps?
I think he had asked for any action items where there would be a follow-up to a question. Would those be noted in this?
We'll definitely note the follow-ups to the question. I understood Commissioner Stump's request to be that this group directs staff to undertake specific actions.
So I don't think that would be appropriate for a study session, but clearly getting the information posted, available to the public, is very important, and I'm sure all of us here and the public may have some follow-ups as well to this session. So how would any follow-up questions be accommodated?
People are welcome to email me at gwhelan, WHELAN, @losgatosca.gov.
Great, thank you. So I would like to just thank everyone involved, from Ms. Couts and Ms. Whalen and our Community Development Department and everyone on staff, as well as the Planning Commission and the Council and the public for engaging in this. It's obviously very important for the future of our town, and I think this may be the 4th study session that we've held, and I would say that by far this one was in the most depth and probably the closest to dealing and grappling with real problems and challenges that we have, but also I think offered some insights into ways that the various deciding bodies can apply the law to making their decisions. So it's been a very helpful session. I want to thank everyone, and this session's adjourned.